All right.
Kick us
I
off.
think it's time to kick off. We can't wait or delay any longer to all the people who are on time. So, first and foremost, super excited that you're here. If you are here for the webinar, text, email, and social, oh my, best practices for communicating with candidates in the recruiting process, you're in the right place. Don't feel like you need to take notes or anything because I'm going to be sending out a recording to everyone who registered. So you'll get that pretty quickly after the webinar is over. If you have questions or, at any point, feel free to drop those in the Q&A box. We'll get to those in the end. That's usually one of our most valuable times on the webinar too. We tend to try to shuffle through quite a few questions in the last 15 to 20 minutes. So feel free to drop those there in the chat box. And I think we should get started. So first, I'm going to let the speakers just introduce themselves. So Martin, let's go ahead and start with you.
I am Martin Payne, CEO of TextUs. I've been on board for coming on a year and a half here, and it's been a great journey so far. And thank you for having me on the webinar today.
Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, that was short and sweet. I'm Steve, CEO of Interseller. My background is mainly in engineering. I've been doing Interseller for now almost 5 years. So yeah, my expertise is actually in email and spam filters. So I'm very, very excited actually to chat a little bit about SMS, because that is a realm that I don't know very well. And I'm happy to also just answer a lot on the email side. So I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Awesome. Steve, I think we got a couple of comments to just bump up your mic a little bit on the volume.
Yeah, okay, so let's change that up, shall we? Hopefully that is a lot better. I don't know, maybe.
That sounds really good. Can I get a thumbs up from some of the people who asked about that, just to make sure we're good? Cool. Sweet. Much better. All right, cool. So just to kind of set the stage, I'm Christina. I lead growth marketing here at Interseller, and I'm also just going to be moderating the conversation with Martin and Steve today. As an overview, we're going to be going over and really trying to dive into some questions that will bring out kind of the importance of a multi-channel approach to recruiting. So specifically really honing in on emailing and texting, because that's their specialties. We're going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of emailing, texting, and some social recruiting as well. And best practices for candidate outreach you can start using immediately. So I have them sharing their secrets. We'll just leave it at that. So question one, I want to just kick off with you, Martin, real fast. Let's talk about recruiting outreach before someone has raised their hand to say, hey, I'm interested in potentially working here, right? They haven't applied. How can you use a multi-channel approach to get more candidates interested and into the process? What have you seen?
Yeah, I think the recruiters that we work with, we see definitely a multi-channel approach, web and social, to get maybe folks opted in or get folks interested. But once they're opted in and interested, perhaps sending out an email that says, hey, here's a position, maybe with a position description of something that you might be interested in, with a follow-up later that comes in the way of texting. Or if someone has actually a deeper indication of interest, you could actually lead off with a text. But I think the key there is to be targeted and thoughtful with your message. And as long as you are, I just think that intent in that thoughtfulness shines through, whether it's email or text. But we actually have seen when you use email and text in the right manner at the right time, we see great results.
Yeah, I also love multi-channel. I think one of the key things that we've, us being kind of like a email sequencing program, over the past several years, we moved over to kind of like emailing plus tasks, manual tasks that you can complete. And we heavily actually promote like a strategy that actually Christina has created called the FIRE framework. And we post a ton on LinkedIn, for example, email also. It's just like a very much needed aspect of multi-channel approach. Like one of the key things I think we learned that was like not everyone responds via email and not everyone responds via LinkedIn. So like having a multi-channel like back and forth is really important to make sure that you're engaging at all levels, at every possible avenue that's available to you.
Yeah, and I'll throw in a little plug for texting because it's kind of the new kid on the block in terms of being in the recruiter's toolbox. So you use LinkedIn, you use email. Our friends over at Daxtra, which is an analytics firm that specializes, that bolts onto Bullhorn basically. Our friends over at Daxtra ran an analysis that said that when you actually interject texting and use it alongside these other channels of communication, they see an 18% higher placement rate versus not. And so adding it as a complement, I think, to these other channels has been really effective.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's a great stat actually. I think like the more you keep a candidate engaged, the better chances you are to place them somewhere that you want them to be at. So cool.
Yeah, and I mean, to that point, I think, no two candidates are created equal. One might be more responsive through email, one may be more responsive to a text message, to, LinkedIn, whatever that might be, GitHub, some sort of other messaging. It just really depends, which is why you should probably spread things out a little bit on channels. Great. I'm learning something new too. Okay, so email, text, and LinkedIn outreach have all encountered some bad blood from candidates over the years. I mean, I think usually people tend to be a little vocal, right, when something doesn't go well in the process. I'm curious if you can speak to the bad habits for each channel that should be avoided, especially for people who are getting started. Although I polled, we have quite a few people who are already using texting at some point in the recruiting process and email sequencing. So
yeah.
Steven, you want to go first this time?
Yeah, I'll go first this time. I think email, since email is my specialty, I'll like talk a little bit more about that. But some of the key things about email is that like, with sequencing programs, yes, you can email like thousands of people at a time, but what we find is that the more broad or generic that you get, the worse your performance becomes. And funny, it's not actually due to any like spam filter reasons. It's actually more like human behavior, right? I think one of the key things is that like if things are too broad, it just doesn't feel personalized. So your initial reaction basically in Gmail is to hit that nice either archive button or report spam, right? Because it just doesn't feel like it is directed towards you, right? So that we find that actually if you gear more towards maybe 100 tailored candidates at a time, which is like kind of like more tailored toward like, let's say a role, a location, a seniority, the more kind of like points, the more like Boolean points, the better that you can add into your sequence, the much higher response rate you're going to get. Typically, I think the best recruiters on our platform do like somewhere the upwards of 70% sometimes by just implementing kind of like these small changes. The follow-ups are extremely important. But really the key thing is like, I think the biggest mistake that we see people do is that like, hey, like think basically the funnel as like a numbers game. And they start basically like, okay, well, if I am starting at 1% response rates, I need a certain amount at the end to get there. They think of it as like, all right, I need to put 10,000 people in the funnel before I can fill one role. Well, in essence, we like to think of it instead of top down. We like to think of it bottom up, which kind of like is like, all right, let's fix your response rate first. Let's get to like 30%, and then we can scale everything from beyond there. At least at that kind of like simple point. But that's the most common mistake. So I'll leave it at that. I'll let Martin speak about maybe another mistake that he's seen.
And I'd say the broadest don't do is don't treat texting like email. They're different for a reason. So for example, texting is a live medium. Like when you get a text, you expect somebody to be on the other end, literally right now looking at their phone, right? And so it's a real-time medium. And so you should use it when you want to engage with somebody in near real time. Email is a bit more of a batch medium. It's more long format. And, you know, there's a certain acceptance level of spam these days because there's just so much more email traffic out there. I'll tell you, when you spam folks on their phone, they do not like it. Somehow it's a little bit more intimate through the texting channel. So treat it as such. So treat it as a live medium. When you want to engage with somebody in real time, if you get a near to real time response, you need to be at the ready to respond back. That's how we see response rates. Our average response rate is 43%. We see response rates in the 70s and the 80s when people treat the medium the way it should be treated. The other way it's different too is it's very short format. You know, very short text messages do very well. Longer messages don't do as well. You know, and also the more you can personalize things through texting, because like I said, you know, people expect a live human being on the other end. You don't want heavy automation. Some automation is fine, but if they're getting automation constantly from you, it kind of violates this rule of, hey, there's supposed to be a live human on the other end of this, and I'm getting something that looks robotic.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I think a long while back, like Interseller ran an SMS experiment, which was like fully automated, and you can imagine the responses we got back. So I would, one thing I would always highly recommend to our customers, by the way, is try to avoid the automation of text messages, similar to like, hey, like, you know, they expect like a live response. I think some of the got a lot of curse words through an experiment of like 100 people of like software engineers, and boy, that right, it's just more of like when it feels like, even if it feels a little bit robotic, it feels like way too robotic, right? And that's just kind of like how people's mental minds kind of like take a lot of this spam these days.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember one of the recruiting roles that I had, this was back when I was in the recruiting seat. I did heavy recruiting for a production facility, and none of them are on LinkedIn. None of them are really checking email either. And so text was a big thing for us. That's how I would coordinate them coming in for a walk-in interview or things like that. So I'm curious, I know this question wasn't necessarily prepped, but I'm kind of thinking too, do you see, and this is specifically for Martin, do you see when it comes to the people using your platform that are, you know, texting candidates and doing it in the recruiting process, have you heard anything about different industries that, or I guess industries or personas that are more responsive, I guess, to that type of communication prior to opt-in even?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question. We see heavy texting use with recruitment onboarding, so very much in the candidate and employee experience, because oftentimes there is kind of a relationship or an expectation that you would reach out kind of unannounced to say, hey, you look like someone that might be interested in this role. We also see it with consumer. You know, we see much more two-way texting with important kind of life purchases or life decisions. Like, for example, you're looking to rent a place, and your real estate agent or your leasing agent says, hey, I found a place that you might be interested in. So it's a proactive outreach, but it's really thoughtful, and it's about something that's important in your life. For the smaller transaction purchases, like getting a delivery notification from Amazon or from whoever else is like nice to get, right? That's a little bit more of a one-way versus a one-to-one bi-directional communication. But that's another consumer use case. We don't see a ton of B2B. It really seems like in the B2B world, you know, that's going to be more of an email-based communication. So maybe like a salesperson over at a recruiting firm communicating with their primary point of contact for their client who they're recruiting for. Like that would be an example of a B2B communication. That really seems to be taking place over email or common Slack channels or Teams channels, for example. So that's where we see some segmentation in the communication flows and where texting seems to do really well.
That totally makes sense to me. I appreciate you sharing that. Also just, I think in general, there's hesitation, right? I know you have quite a few like TextUs fans and people who are not foreign to texting and recruiting on the webinar. But there is like a general hesitation too on incorporating text into the process, because I think there might be a lack of understanding and maybe even adoption, right? On how it can help the process. Can you chat a little bit about this topic? And again, if there is some way that you can maybe tap into how some of the customers are using it in a positive way, that would be great.
Yeah, totally. So I just start off by saying, a lot of you out there in the audience have used texting. Feel free to recommend how you might do so through your own stories in the chat. I'll just pull from the experiences of our customers. I'll start off with the macro. Right now, just if you look at texting volume versus email volume, texting volume is about 10% of email volume. And so there's just, at a macro level, there's just a lot fewer businesses texting with their customers than there are email. And I think you can probably extend that over into the recruitment world. So if you were to adopt texting, there's a pretty good chance that there's just not a lot of other recruiters doing it. There's material number, but not a ton of recruiters doing it. And so you'll kind of stand out. The other thing too is I would just use it as a natural complement to the other channels that you're already comfortable using, LinkedIn, email. And I would do it, if I were just wading into it for the first time, I would just go 100% conversational. Like I wouldn't try any kind of automation, nothing real fancy. And I would try to be as conversational and personalized as possible, which is like, okay, you send an email out to a person. I'd be like, you know what, for a subset of the contacts that receive the email, I'm going to try a texting follow-up. Nice short one-liner. Hey, I sent you this email. Just wanted to make sure you got it. Sending you a text as a follow-up. Feel free to respond in text if you want to learn a little bit more about it. So very non-intrusive, kind of easy way to get into it. And then as you start to develop really good patterns there and just get used to it on a one-to-one follow-up basis, then you can maybe try something else a bit more programmatic and get into it, using campaigns, which is more broadcast. It's where you can send a personalized message out to, tens or maybe a couple of hundred contacts in your database.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's kind of like crawl, walk, run, right?
Yeah.
Like it really is. You should maybe start out and see how you feel about it at that sub level before just kind of going all in, right?
Yeah, and almost develop your own style, because your own personal style is actually what's going to carry the day. Because like I said, it's a live medium. And if they know that it's Christina on the other end and you've got kind of your own style for how you text, you've got certain emojis that you use, and you see that it works, it's going to work for you and probably scale very nicely, but specifically for you.
Makes sense completely.
Yeah, cool. Actually, funny you brought up style, which is like part of our kind of like CSM secret sauce. Actually, is a lot of the time the companies that or customers that we talk to, they ask us to write their email sequence for them. And typically we basically say like, we don't allow ourselves to write the email sequences for you, primarily because A, we're not you. B, we don't know your industry as well. C, we don't know your candidates either. So like one of the key things that we find that does just really well is when you have a very organic kind of like outreach with your candidates, those respond the best. The ones that respond, like we have like kind of a correlation between like the more, depending on the industries obviously, but the more robotic, the more business-like you feel, the less chances are that person is going to respond back to you. It's just like in a sense of like your own personal style, your own knowledge on the industry like shows way better than what we could ever provide. But one thing that we do is like we have our customers provide the language and we provide feedback on their language.
Before we move off to the next question, I want to thank Jerry Walls for reminding me I want to go back to the prior question about where does texting work well versus not. There was actually one cut in the recruitment space that I forgot about, and Jerry actually reminded me. For very, I'd say mobile workers, which tend to be hourly, but there's some professional mobile workers too that just spend their time on the go versus in front of a computer, which is more of a knowledge worker and probably more salaried. Texting becomes like vital. It becomes vital because if you're doing hourly blue collar, they might not own a computer. If you're working with a nurse or a doctor, they own a computer, but they're probably not in front of it, right? Whereas when you're dealing with the knowledge worker, they're probably in front of a computer. And so, email is perfectly acceptable there. Maybe with some texting is a complement. But for those other segments, spot on response there. It's like, it's the dominant mode because they're always on the go or they own a computer.
Yeah, amazing. I find that like people who spend like most of their time on phones probably respond way better to SMS than email.
Yeah.
Just like the topic of this webinar, which is the multi-channel approach, right? Like you always want to like make sure you're approaching at the right mediums to that target market, and then part two is just like making sure you're approaching them at all angles, primarily because like again, one industry that Martin mentioned, like computers, they may own computers, but they're not looking at it all the time, but they're always on the go and looking at their phone all the time, for example. And so there are many different ways to approach, and we find that like again, like one thing in our company too, year 1 and 2, we were only email. We had a very strict policy that we can only reach out in email. Year 3, year 4 of our company, we started targeting the same people in year 1 and year 2, and they responded more amenably through LinkedIn. And so there's just kind of like this weird realm that if you're only utilizing one, you're missing out. You should utilize every possible channel you could imagine, or really, I would say the ones that your target market is going to be responding through.
Yeah, I'd even say there's nuances within your target, right? Like,
Yep.
And I found that too, just because, we do a lot of outbound here on the sales side. And I apologize, they're mowing here. So if you hear mowing in the background, that's just life. But yeah, it's like a toss up. Some people are just more responsive on different channels, but okay, Steve, this question's for you because I want to switch gears to email and social because you just mentioned LinkedIn too. And we do a lot there as well as part of our mix. There's this spray and pray mentality that happens on both channels. And I'm sure if I asked a poll about this question, have you ever had someone connect with you and immediately pitch you on something, whether it's a job or a sales pitch? I guarantee most people would probably say yes in the chat. But a lot of our conversations I know with recruiters have to do with becoming less reliant on InMail and LinkedIn Recruiter and things like that, just because the channel's gotten somewhat antiquated in certain ways. Are you able to kind of dig into that topic a little bit and maybe share some ways our customers are using both channels effectively?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that, like, just to give you a little bit of context on myself, I maintain 2 email inboxes for this reason. I'm sure Martin does in some form or way too. I get probably about 30 to 35 pitches per day in terms of just like B2B related like topics, right? I actually have to like filter through them pretty heavily, and it comes in quite a large volume. So just to put in context, right? Like a CEO of a 15-person company is getting around 35. So like the sea, there's like, you have to make yourself differentiated in that sea of like a ton of email coming through, right? That's not even including my spam box. So that's just how much volume I get. On terms of like, funny enough, I still get like people still ask me about their engineering roles. I'm like, I'm way out of that game. I haven't done engineering like in so long, but I still get like, maybe like 2 or 3 of those a day too. So the other part I would say about LinkedIn for me, especially as a CEO, is that like I gate basically my connection requests quite a lot now too. From time like now, LinkedIn has that ability, right, to send a note in the connection request, right? And so like every single connection request of mine actually just go like, hey, I would love to speak to you about this topic, or I'd love to speak to you about that. Funny, my brain now has been trained to ignore anything that has a message in it and just like and then take a deeper look into ones that don't have a message in it, primarily because like if I actually interacted with you before in the past, the chances of me looking at that connection request is like, or sorry, adding a note to that connection request is lower. Right. I think short like the and then if you actually take a look at that connection box, right, and you see like it only shows maybe maybe like 10 words, right, and then it says like see more, and then it shows you the entire note. One key thing that I always will tell people is like the shorter the better, because if it is longer, people do not tend to press, oh, let me read this guy's pitch by pressing see more, right? It just doesn't happen. And now if you I think Christina mentioned this like a while back, which was spam is getting so bad, especially on a like kind of like a remote world, that like LinkedIn has to start kind of like pressuring more rules on their platform, right? I think it's now that like the number of connection requests you can do per week is 100 or something near that line. So the thing, like again, just as things get wider and wider in terms of like the number of emails, the like basically the more pressure there is on LinkedIn, Gmail, and Outlook to basically filter the stuff that is irrelevant to you away from your inbox. And so one key thing really is just like you have to differentiate yourself from everyone else. The best way to do it is to like, again, keep it to your language, keep it to your voice. Those perform the best because again, your industry way better than anyone else could. So Christina, I think you had a second question.
Well, I have another question. Yeah, I think it was more just like, do you know some ways our customers are using both channels effectively? That's
yeah
question.
Yeah, so sometimes I find that a combination basically between kind of like email, LinkedIn message, email, and then like a connection request sometimes do really well. And the order sometimes we ourselves change depending on how like we feel and kind of like people are responding to. So I think in our own framework we do something like connection request first or like an in-mail first, and then we do an email to follow up on that, and then kind of like do a summary, and then do like another like LinkedIn in-mail, or sometimes we would like comment on someone's like post if they're social on like LinkedIn. We'll kind of like follow up with them in a, hey, if they made a statement, we'll kind of like follow up on that statement through a comment. And then we'll just keep engaging through like that like method of channel. But remember, we're going after recruiters, and guess where recruiters spend most of their time, right? They spend most of their time on LinkedIn. So we love the LinkedIn platform because that's where our entire network base is. Again, another thing too is like on the candidate side, people who are looking for positions, where do they go? The first thing that they probably think of is two places. I'm pretty sure it would be LinkedIn and Indeed, right? I think those are like kind of like the two main places where like candidates would levitate towards. So for recruiters, I highly recommend kind of like that same level of cadence, which is like, send an email about like kind of like the role, why they're a good fit, like why, and maybe touch on maybe a social point that they may have posted. I would then send a connection request as my second touch point. My third one would basically be another email that says like just trying to like follow up on that cadence. And then same thing, fourth one would be maybe another comment or another in-mail. So and I think one thing that we do that's like kind of like a hidden secret, I think, like Christina, we do LinkedIn voice messages. Yeah, so you can only do it on your phone, right? And we leave voice messages on to that prospect, to that lead, to like better show that we are actually like engaging with them, and we do that pretty decently at scale. So yeah, that's kind of like how we've seen it used really, really effectively between multiple platforms. Depending on industries, for example, like healthcare, we'll find that like there will be an SMS step in between too. So some, again, like we mentioned before, some just industries just do way better, just primarily because like that phone is like the thing that they work off of to be connected to the world. Um, Rather than some industries like software engineering, I'll tell you, is not a great one. I do not find that to do to go very well. So
Yeah, I think the biggest point here too is test. The marketer in me just wants to say test, 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 because there's really no silver bullet. And if any of you find one, please share your secrets, or you probably keep them to
or
yourself. But
sell your secret if you
sell
have a
your
silver bullet.
secret. Yes, but there's no silver bullet. But love those tips and love what you said too, Martin. So before we get into the Q&A, which we do have quite a few questions, feel free to drop those in. I kind of want to end here with one final question to both of you. And Martin, I'm going to have you kick this off. Give us your 3 to 5, it could be more, I don't care, your best practices for using text as part of the outreach before and during the recruiting process. And then for you, Steve.
So I will actually share some of our secrets here. So TextUs is like, we're somewhere around 1 billion text messages sent over the last few years, so a lot. And so we've culled some insights just for the recruiting industry. And this comes from us looking at breaking down our recruiting users by quartile. So the most proactive users, or actually I should rephrase that, those with the top 25% in terms of response rate, which by the way is about a 75% response rate, that represents the top quartile of TextUs users. They actually go outbound twice as often as the average. So be a bit proactive here. So being proactive actually is really the thing. And don't you probably think that you're annoying people. Actually, the annoyance limit, if you will, is probably a bit higher than you think it is. So be proactive, because you're probably reaching out to someone who's pretty busy. And your second text is just going to be a friendly reminder that they might be interested in this. The second piece of data that I think is important for folks to understand is if you get a text response back, respond quickly. It's a live medium. Most people expect a live person on the other end, which means a response in a minute or two. This is borne out in the data as well. Our top quartile users respond on average 40% faster than the average texter. And then lastly, use shorter messages. Top quartile on average has a 25% shorter message length than the average. And then I would say if you're gonna move into more programmatic, widespread use of texting within your organization, or maybe you yourself, I consider moving to a texting platform. Because you're gonna see things like higher deliverability, the ability to manage many conversations at scale. You'll get automation features, and just as important, you'll see integration with your ATS so that you can share contacts, share opt-ins. There'll be note logging that goes back to your system of record. Those are really for folks who've committed more to the texting channel. Yeah, and just remember, texting is a very kind of personal, intimate channel. So the more you personalize, even in your automation, the better off you'll be.
Yeah. My favorite secrets. My favorite secrets for email, by the way, is the best subject lines that perform in basically open rates actually only have 2 words, 2 words or less. To envision that is very, very, very short. And there's a reason why behind it too, right? So normally what we like to do is like, sometimes like the best recruiters on our platform will say just "hey" in the subject line, or like or like maybe like how is it at the company that they're currently working at, right? Things to kind of like actively engage and open that email. The reason why we like it so short, and it's like sometimes it's like 10 characters or less in the subject line. The reason why we like it so short is primarily because if you ever look at your email on your phone and you got one with a really long subject line, it truncates. It actually just stops after 30 characters, right? And so you if you like basically make your subject line way too wordy, then all the meat basically gets truncated off of that out of that mobile device or like in your email inbox too. So we like to usually like get to the point in those first couple of characters, or sorry, the first couple of words, so that way like someone can read it and pick it up very quickly, and then open your email and then read the rest, right? Because the key thing is that subject line is like the key thing that gets someone to open your email. That's like my like best secret in subject lines. And I think in terms of responses, the body of most typical emails, the body of most typical emails are like maybe 5 sentences or less. They're super short. They're super to the point. There's a lot of white space, so it's easily readable, right? It's just like I can read the key things that are like clearly like benefits to me, and then I'm like, great, I like all these things, so let me read the rest of the email and then respond back. So those are usually like the best performing emails. Last but not least, maybe this isn't a secret, but like we find that people tend to ignore the first email most of the time. In fact, that there are about 2.5 times more responses on the second email than there is on the first email. So that's another key secret. If you're not following up, you have lost. There is way more responses on like your follow-ups than there are on your first email. So I think the way we like to kind of see it, if you get one response for every like X amount of emails, you get one response on your first email. You get about 2 to 3 on your second email. Your third and fourth will get also like diminishing returns, which is like it starts becoming like 1.5 and 1 on average as it keeps going, and then 0.5. Maximum, we usually like to say like cut it off after 5 emails, get to the point after that. If you have not engaged with them, everything beyond that is just kind of like hitting them too many times, and then spam filters start picking up on that, which then like affects your deliverability to email any other Gmail account. So we tend to be like, cool, get to the point within 4 to 5 emails at most.
I love those tips. The power of follow-up, I think in any channel you're using is really key. And those pattern interrupts really work too, like using a GIF or, something to bump that way. Those tend to do very well. I mean, there's sometimes we run 7 to 9 steps in our outbound process here. We get the meeting on the 7th or 9th step. Like it just happens. It's that polite persistence without being obnoxious. So awesome. Well, listen, we have a lot of questions to go through. So don't worry if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, you can still drop that in the Q&A or chat. I think I'm going to try to run through these pretty quick. Martin, you had mentioned, I think in your best practices about having kind of a short and punchy texting. Can you define short by character count?
Yes, great question. So 160 characters, I'll just start with the outer limit. If your message goes beyond 160 characters, your message is going to get chopped up into chunks and be delivered as separate messages by the mobile carriers. And so really to stay within that, it's got to be less than 160. But I would say an ideal to shoot for is right around 100. And also think from your own personal experience too, when you're getting text from your friends or your family, I mean, they tend to be, definitely 100 characters or less.
Okay. And then just to kind of piggyback on that, you know, I don't know if you can speak to the full multi-channel spacing between steps, but do you know how far apart do you normally have people space, like a second email, call, or text, whatever that might look like?
Yeah, I mean, over in the texting world, you know, it'll be a day or two, so we won't wait that long over on the texting side of things. In part, I think maybe because it is a bit more of um, a more responsive mechanism, if you will. I mean, people just kind of expect it to be fairly responsive on text. Not that email isn't, but like I said, it's like a near real time kind of channel.
That makes sense. And on email, Steve, I think I know the answer, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, for email, I think our typical suggestion is like your first couple of emails should be within like the first next day to maximum 5 days in business days. And then you want to try to space out your emails after that to like 7 days, so that way you're like utilizing the full window of time. You also don't want to like be like too needy, though. I do find that like depending on just kind of like your recruiter's goals, sometimes it'll be like super heavy on first initial contact initially, and then the follow-ups will occur maybe like a week down the road, just primarily because you need to engage with 100 people first. It really depends. I would say the best ones, what was it? Our stat was like the best follow up for the second email is usually next day, between next day and 3 days is like the best window. Kind of like after that, it's becoming like less top of mind, right? If they read your first email and then like they get a flood of other ones, and then they forget basically who you are, what you mentioned. And so that's why it's important to like kind of like follow up at the top of mind initially, and then like engage more on a weekly basis, kind of like beyond that phase. But we try to keep it within like, not like, think of it as like we don't want to be annoying, and we also want to make sure we're top of mind. It's like a very strange balance that you got to keep.
Makes sense. Yeah. And if you're using LinkedIn, because I'll speak to this since we use that channel a lot. We usually space like between 2 to 3 days after, like in between emails, basically. And we're very, very intentional about connecting. There's an email in between. So there can sometimes be, with a weekend, 5 to 7 days before you're actually doing something like a message or a voice message. So that's not a connect and pitch. So I think that intentionality and testing those steps in the right space is also important too. Let's see here. Do you feel we are losing the human touch when it comes to interviewing and hiring people due to the last year, right? We've all kind of seen the last year. It says most interviews are being done via Zoom or over the phone. You don't get the same feel from a candidate when it's face-to-face interview versus a video call. I think this is more of like just how are you guys feeling about what's going on and kind of the shift here? I don't know who wants to take that first.
Yeah, I'll go first. Recruiting is kind of like hiring is kind of like my passion a little bit in for Interseller. I think in previous years, and I don't think it's just like this year alone because of COVID, I think that it's been a very, very competitive game for quite a while now. That like now we're like in this notion of like, okay, cool, we need to like message everyone possible in order to grab the top talent in the industry. Yes, I do find that like a lot of companies these days follow a very like methodical like practice, a very programmatic practice that just eliminates like kind of like the human touch, right? I think one of the key things for our company, especially a small one, is that we actually flip the script, which is basically like I actually I start the interview with everyone on call one. Everyone that we've kind of like selected, being like, great, let's like, this guy or girl is really interested, and we may not be like the top company in the industry. So essentially having the CEO like kind of like get on that first call. Basically my goal is to like convince them that they should go through our hiring process to then get an offer towards the end. Otherwise, what tends to happen is like, oh, you don't get to talk to anyone until like interview 5, right? We have to like filter you through like these 3 technical things or like these like writing exercises and stuff like that. And so we like flipping the script. We like being a lot more human up front and then kind of like going through the interview post after that. Very human touch.
It's a great approach, Stephen. I'm making notes here. In short, yes, I do think COVID is put us in a position where we have pretty much been forced to lose the human touch, and most everybody I talk to, myself included, is really yearning to get that human, like that live human element back. I just don't think there's a substitute for it, and that being said, to the extent that there is a live connection that's made, some of the digital technologies really would serve to enhance that or accentuate it. But yeah, there's really no substitute, I think, for a live interaction.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to try to powerhouse now because we've got a lot of questions. So someone had put in here, last research I've read, according to candidates discussing how they want to be contacted. Number 1 was emails. Number 2 was LinkedIn message. And number 3 was text. Do either one of you have any updates around that topic, or what you've kind of seen?
Yeah. Email, like, I think it's just like like what Martin has been saying, right? Like text is live, right? You should expect a live answer if you send a text message, and at the same time, like the person on the other end expects it to be live also. I think another, like, again, you want to be as like 100% human on the text message side, because that's just kind of like how we interact with our phones today. For email, it's kind of like a little bit, there's like this weird kind of like known rule about email, which is like, it's like casual. It's like, I don't have to respond to this in a while. It's kind of like treated almost as a task list or like informational things that I need to know, right? And so email is usually, I would say, like, is a great medium for especially cold outreach, primarily because like there's just like this strange thought of just like, oh, okay, like inherently I'm gonna get spam, or like inherently this is going to happen. We all kind of like, we all have this common law or like rule that everyone understands that was just like, okay, cool. Email is good for that. And then for like LinkedIn messages, I would say is like goes into the world of social media. It's kind of like at your own risk, if that makes sense. Similar to like like if you were to go on Reddit or something like that. So I think that order, in my opinion, would actually be pretty spot on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, especially if you're talking about somebody, if some of this is like the way the question is phrased, in a survey, it's like, oh, okay, well, if someone reaches out to me, I'm not necessarily sure who that person is or what they're reaching out to me about, what that subject matter is exactly. And so we see that as well. Folks want to be texted once there's a little bit more vetting, because as Stephen said, it is a live medium and it's more personal as well. And so when you use it at the right time, that's when you just see super high engagement rates, 43% on average, but it's not unusual to see 70 to 80% response rate when you use it the right way at the right time. So I would totally agree. And then, back to a point you made, Christina, earlier on, is that's an average, but it really depends. It depends on your style. It also depends on what vertical you're in, what type of worker or candidate you're working with. And so part of it's got to be this pattern recognition of, hey, am I trying to recruit a travel nurse? Okay, well, maybe I'll start using texting earlier than I would an IT professional, right, who's in front of their computer all the time. And so some of it's very situational, some of it's stylistic. And so the answer is also going to depend.
Yeah, that leads me to this next question that I think is, this was kind of my greatest curiosity too, is do you recommend using texting for cold outreach when you have not interacted with the candidate before?
Yeah, that's a pretty tough one because of the reasons we just mentioned. if you get a random, like just a rando text message from a rando phone number, it can be actually a fair amount of people find that pretty off-putting. And so I think, it's got to be more the exception than the rule. And then the other reason here too is the mobile carriers are in the process of implementing a program called 10DLC, which is the purpose of 10DLC is actually to prevent things like unauthorized texting use, like spam and things of that nature. So once we get in that world, it's going to be awfully tough to reach out to people cold through a text message, because that kind of traffic will start getting blocked by the carriers. There are exceptions though. There are use cases where you have to go out cold to those, but it'll just be use case dependent.
Yeah, I was like, I was reading about SMS. Like, I think it's getting more expensive because like some of the carriers are like charging like a tax, where like you have to register with them now of your numbers and stuff like that. So, yeah, interesting, cool.
Yeah. And I think, so are you saying that it would be kind of similar to now how, like for me, when I get a phone call, a lot of times they'll actually say something like spam, or like it's identified as, spam. What are you saying that new kind of regulation would potentially do that, or even just prevent it from coming through on the text side?
Yeah, a bit of both. They might allow it through once you register, but if they start to pick up certain patterns, they've got spam filters that it's like a Google search algorithm. It's like it constantly changes, it gets smarter. And if they pick up on certain patterns, I mean, they've already started to actually get more stringent about blocking you. And in some cases, if you have a use case, they just might block the use case, or they might rate limit you. They're doing that with the intent of keeping texting as this fairly personal, near real-time medium, that it's something that they do want to preserve. And that's the overall intent, to make it more secure and preserve it as this very high engagement kind of medium, and leave, a little bit more of the spamminess out of it.
Makes sense. Okay. Would you say that entry-level positions and blue-collar positions is best to communicate via text or email, and why? And would a formal or informal form of communication be better for more entry-level and blue-collar positions? Not sure who wants to start with that one.
Steven, you want to start on that one?
Yeah. For email, I tend to find that like entry-level positions, especially like positions like out of college, for example, could do really well. It just really depends. It's like, this is a very dependent question. There's a lot of like things that like would affect my answer here. I think one of those key things is that like for, we do data also, and for just out of school, we tend to like our data coverage for just out of school is very, very minimal at best. And so channels like other channels like career fairs, or ones that do focus more on kind of like the internship level of things, or work with like the schools directly, is way better than kind of like email itself. For blue collar, I'm not like what would define blue collar? I'm like trying to like think now. My brain is blanking.
Manufacturing line worker, construction worker.
Yeah, if it's a very specialized kind of like blue collar job, like a very specialized skill, we do really, really well in that, just primarily because like those guys again have like skills that people want to buy left and right. If you were to kind of like say like an Amazon, like for example, an Amazon warehouse worker, we probably would not get any type of response at all. Again, like those guys probably have rules where they can't even like look at their phone or like answer an email while they're on the job. So, I unfortunately don't have enough data to speak on blue collar, but like entry level positions, I tend to find that like the data coverage is low, but the outreach via email tends to respond pretty well.
It's definitely generational for sure. Millennials, I'll just use my son as an example. He's had an email account for years. He checks it, I don't know, once a month, and so generationally speaking, I think social and texting in particular are like really, really key, regardless of the type of position. The other one, I'd say hourly for sure. Texting probably needs to be your predominant mode of communications with hourly, because they're not really going to be on a computer much of the day. They're just constantly on the go, and that's just not part of their professional work habits, so to speak. The other folks I'd say are the mobile professionals. Like healthcare is kind of classic. They're just constantly on the go. And so we find that with recruiters that use us for healthcare recruiting, texting is like the predominant mode of communications. Now, when we do have IT and professional as well. And with those folks, it's much more of a complementary use with email, because email for sure is really important with that constituency. But texting is a great way to like follow up, to come in with a different mode, change it up a little bit, like Steven talked about before. When you kind of start to mix modes, you can get the attention of people more. And for IT professional folks, it's a really nice complement to email in that way.
Yeah. And just speaking from my experience too, when I was recruiting more like super entry level roles, I'll tell you, a lot of times, especially if it's maybe their first role or first like internship out of college, they're looking for you to kind of set the expectation on what communication looks like between you two, because they're not as familiar with interviewing and hiring and being a candidate. And so I think if you set that expectation early, like, hey, I'm a texter, are you a texter? Or, hey, I'm into email, like what works for you? You'll find that they want to soak up that knowledge because they're really not sure what's acceptable and what's not. And they're going to err on the side of formality versus like, or being more formal versus the latter. I think we have time for one more question. I know there's a couple of outstanding questions here. Feel free to follow up with us, or we'll try to follow up afterwards with some answers here. We have one that says we do job fairs. So they do open interviews for 2 days and then final interviews on the 3rd day. How can text to apply work for us on hiring events? We don't do long drawn out hiring processes, more hiring event style recruiting.
Yeah, that's where I'd recommend using a texting platform, shameless plug, like TextUs, where and the reason why is you would integrate with the system of record that would have information at your disposal. Like, for example, you might be able to embed a link, and make sure it's a registered domain so that you don't get blocked, but embed a link so that they can actually click on that link as part of your message sequence there. Click on that link to actually go be linked to the web page or some kind of form where they can enter that information, and that information gets captured in your system of record.
Love that idea. Awesome. Look at us. We're wrapping up right on time. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you to everyone for attending today. Again, I'll send out the recording here within the next hour or so. Steve, Martin, thank you so much for giving up a little bit over an hour of your time just to come and talk with us. I'm going to say it's safe to assume if people want to connect, they could also connect with you on LinkedIn. Just don't send Steve a note. Okay. Make it blank.
Thank you so much, Christina.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great one, guys.
Bye.
Bye.